Praise the Lord. Well, where we're going today is the Book of Ruth. Let me see. Rob, are we rolling on recording?
We are rolling.
Okay, that's great. And what I want to do is I want to start by giving an introduction to the Book of Ruth. It's a wonderful story. It's a heartwarming story, and there's a lot in the background that really helps us. And there's a lot of lessons in Ruth. Again, this is one of those places that you can take a notebook and just kind of, as you read through the Book of Ruth and as you get a hold of it, you can write down, you know, here's a lesson here, here's a lesson here, here's another lesson. This is what I've learned. This is what I've seen, because that really is what the book of the Bible and stuff is about. Yes, yes, it gives us history, but more than that, it's an expression of God's heart. And we really see that in the Book of Ruth. Ruth is such an amazing book to show us both the heart of God and the life of people and how they behave and how they make choices. So one of the first things we see, of course, you look at the Book of Ruth and it's named Ruth. So one of the first things we see is it's named after a woman, but it's also the only book named after a non-Israelite. Out of the 39 books of the Bible, the Book of Ruth is the only book named after a non-Israelite. Ruth, of course, was a Moabite. And the fact that Ruth was a Moabite is written up at least a half a dozen times. I didn't take the time to read all 4 chapters and count every single use, but I did count quickly that there were more than a half dozen times that the Bible tells us that Ruth was a Moabite. And that's, as we get a little deeper into both the introduction and to the text itself, it'll become apparent why God would make that point over and over and over again. Because Ruth, I mean, here's a lesson. You know, Ruth had a choice to go to Israel or not. Ruth had a choice whether to accept Yahweh or not. And she made choices, and she made choices in spite of the potential hardships. And we need to be aware of that. And so one of the lessons we learn right away from Ruth is, if you're doing the will of God in your life, you may face hardships. That's what Paul taught in the book of Acts. Through many hardships, we enter the kingdom of God. And this is an important concept for us to get. And Ruth really faced those hardships and hit them head on. As far as the book itself, we don't know when it was written, and we don't know who wrote it. If you read the commentaries, there's a whole bunch of different guesses out there. But the bottom line is, we don't know when it was written, and we don't know who wrote it. We know it was at least written after the life of David, because it mentions David. Some people say, well, it doesn't mention Solomon in the genealogy, so it probably was written either late in the life of David or early in the life of Solomon. But the fact of the matter is, you can't draw a conclusion from that, because in ending with David, the Book of Ruth is pointing to the greater David, the Messiah. And of course, Ruth becomes part of the genealogy of the Messiah. So we don't know when Ruth was written. We don't know who wrote it. We do know the time it occurred. The actual record occurred, and we learned that from Ruth 1:1. Let's see. One of the great lessons that I think we see from Ruth, but it's not stated in the book, it comes from the scope of Scripture, is what's going on in the Book of Ruth. I mean, here's the Book of Judges, and the Book of Judges is a series of cycles where the Israelites would disobey God, and then because they disobeyed, they would go into slavery, and then they would get upset and they would repent, and then God would raise up a deliverer, and then there'd be a time of peace, and that in that time of peace and prosperity, they'd go back into disobedience. And you had this cycle over and over again in the Book of Judges, and against that backdrop, you have the story of Ruth, which occurred during the time of the judges. In fact, there's very good evidence that occurred during the time of the judgeship of Deborah, which in and of itself will provide a backdrop by the time we get to chapter 2. But the point is that that against this backdrop of this Israel turning to pagan gods, turning away from Yahweh, here's Ruth, and it's it's about the Book of Ruth, family situations, family struggles, normal life, death, marriage, childbirth, growing crops, feeding yourself. That Ruth really focuses on the family. But one of the great lessons that stands out is here's Ruth from Moab coming into Israel, who boldly accepts Yahweh as her God at a time when the native Israelites, who should have accepted God, rejected him. In fact, what's the verse? It's Judges chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. We might as well just go there in the text. Let's just go to Judges chapter 2 and verse 13. And it says, well, let's go to verse 11 and get the context. Then the children of Israel did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh and served the Baals. And they forsook Yahweh, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, which would include Moab, by the way, and bowed themselves down to them. And they made Yahweh angry. Verse 13, they forsook Yahweh and served Baal and the Ashtaroths. So here's the backdrop to the book of Ruth. At a time when the Israelites were forsaking God and turning to Baal, turning to Ashereth, turning to the sexual practices that went along with cultic prostitution and that kind of thing, that here's a Moabite woman who comes out of that system and declares that Yahweh is her God. And that's, the backdrop of that, the irony of that is amazing. It came up in one of my earlier teachings. I forget who brought forth the question about, what about the people of other countries? What about the people of other religions? And Ruth is a stellar example and a great lesson about how each person makes up their own mind about the true God, because there's plenty of evidence out there that Yahweh is the true God, and plenty of evidence that the other gods don't really work. And it's the brilliance of Ruth as a young woman in her 20s who leaves her family and her native gods and comes to Israel to worship Yahweh. That just is so brilliant, so bright in the culture. A great theme in the book of Ruth is redemption. This is represented by the words redeem, redemption, redeeming, kinsman, redeemer, and words like that based off of the root word redemption occur some over 20 times in the 4-chapter book of Ruth. So redemption is a really big deal. Now that brings us to one of the sticky points in the background of the book of Ruth, because I was taught, and it's pretty commonly taught, that Boaz was a type of Christ and he's a kinsman redeemer. And it is true that Boaz became a type of Christ, but not because he was a kinsman redeemer. It was because of the role he played, stepping into the role of kinsman redeemer. And that becomes it's a subtle distinction that's very important to make, because it's very obvious from the book of Ruth that any one of Elimelech's male relatives that had means, in other words, the means to support another wife and family, any one of those people could be a kinsman redeemer. In fact, Naomi in Ruth chapter 2, verse 20 says, well, let's just go there. Let's just go to Ruth chapter 2, verse 20. This is a super important point, so I want you to get this, because this is mistaught, and frankly, it's been mistaught by me. So, it was years ago, but I needed to correct my theology, because it's so easy to say, oh, Boaz is a type of the kinsman redeemer. He is, but not because of the person, because of the role that he stepped into. So here is Ruth chapter 2, verse 20. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, and this is after Ruth tells her, oh, I was I was gleaning in the field of this guy named Boaz. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law Ruth, blessed be Yahweh be the one who has not forsaken his covenant faithfulness to the living and to the dead. And Naomi said to her, this man is a close relative to us, one of our kinsman redeemers. So any male relative of means could be a kinsman redeemer. This then becomes super important when we actually look at the record, because when we look at the record of Ruth, you have two men. Boaz wanted to be the kinsman redeemer, but he said, yeah, I'd like to do it, but I'm second in line, which tells you that there were not only Boaz, but at least one guy ahead of him. And the fact that Naomi said one of our kinsman redeemer, I mean, you can imagine how many male relatives Elimelech probably had. He probably had a lot of them. So there were a lot of potential kinsman redeemer. And then you have these two men. And the one man is actually closer than Boaz, and he can step into the role of kinsman redeemer, no problem. He was first in line. Yet what happened? Due to his selfishness and his desire to make sure that he and his immediate family were well taken care of, he passed on the opportunity to step into the role of kinsman redeemer. And Boaz, who was second in line, was much more, he wanted to help, he wanted to bless, he wanted to make sure that this widow, Naomi, and this widow, Ruth, were well taken care of. And he stepped into the role of kinsman redeemer, which is what Jesus Christ did. I examined my life so hard in preparing this teaching. And I asked myself, would I die for me? And I had a tough time. I was like, oh my gosh. And I think I'm one of the pretty good ones. I look around out there at the robbers and thieves and liars and people into multiple sexual affairs and all this stuff that people are doing. And I'd say, and I wouldn't die for them, And the cool part about Jesus Christ, and he didn't want, he wanted to redeem us, but he didn't want to die for us the way he did. 3 times in the garden, Father, is there any way to do this besides me being tortured and die for those guys? And God said, no, son, this is the way it's got to be. And so he did. And the beauty of Boaz is he risked his inheritance. He risked dividing up. He didn't know how many children he was going to have by Ruth. My God, Ruth could have been, one of these ladies that popped out babies every 9 months with great regularity. And the next thing you know, all of Boaz's stuff is divided up. He took a chance. He took a risk because he knew what was the right thing to do. Gosh, and that's what Jesus did. He took a risk on us and he died for us. And the beauty of Boaz is not that he was the kinsman redeemer. It's that he stepped into the role of kinsman redeemer. And in that sense, he became a type of Christ who stepped into the role of kinsman redeemer and died for us and paid for our sins so we get to live. And I tell you, I got so reproved personally while doing this teaching because there are people that I think that I've held back on helping because I just kind of like God helps those who help themselves and they're completely unwilling to help themselves and blah, blah, blah. And you probably know the dialogue, and we'll get into this more deeply in the book of Ruth, but I'll tell you what, God has, we can act just like Boaz. We can be the kinsman redeemer for people around us who need help. And that was a gigantic lesson to me because I'd been stuck on this thing trying to read Ruth to get Boaz to be the kinsman redeemer, the type of Christ. And I never could do it. It never worked. And then finally, it was in these last 2-3 well translating Ruth with Schlegel for one thing. And he's brilliant, absolutely an amazing man to work with. Can't think of a better man on the planet to work with than Schlegel. He's amazing. And in translating the book of Ruth and then doing all the commentary work, really, I just finally, it was like the light bulb just went on in my head, and it was like, wait a minute, he's not the kinsman redeemer. He stepped into the role of kinsman redeemer because he made the choice, and that's exactly what Jesus Christ did. And so in that sense, Boaz is a type of Christ. It's absolutely powerful. That having been said, see, all this together makes Ruth just a wonderful book to read. I mean, first of all, what is the old saying? Everyone loves a happy ending. Ruth is so much like life. It starts with bitterness and hardship and goes through to where there's this great happy ending. And here's this Moabite woman that's pulled into the genealogy of Christ, and just shows God's heart, that God works with anybody who wants to love and serve him. It's just a fantastic book from that standpoint. And of course, the Book of Ruth also, as it closes out in chapter 4 by giving the genealogy, then ties into the rest of the Bible, because Ruth is pulled in, like Rahab the prostitute is pulled into the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So just a great, wonderful thing in the Book of Ruth as we start out. So let's at that point, let's turn to the Book of Ruth, and we're going to start right in chapter 1. So we're going to start with Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. And it says, "It came to pass in the days when the judges judged," and it gives you the noun and the verb there, came to pass when the judges judged. And so we already know we're in the book of Judges. Now, where in the book of Judges? Now, I'm not going to go and do this right now, because when we get to chapter 4, we'll go through the genealogy. But if you want to get ahead of yourself and read my commentary on Judges chapter 4, verse 18, you'll see the genealogy given in Ruth, which I think we of STF are one of the few theological organizations that actually believes that's literal. And you'll read about why that is if you read my commentary on Judges 4:18. I believe, based on the chronology that we've done of the Old Testament and the chronology of the book of Ruth and the men who are mentioned in Scripture in the genealogy, that Ruth occurred during the time of the judgeship of Deborah. Now, that's going to mean a lot more by the time we get into chapter 2 than it does right now. But there was just horrible Canaanite oppression during the time of during the time of Deborah. And I think it's more than irony. I think it's actually the providential hand of God in showing what he can accomplish, that in the days of Deborah, he raised up Deborah, a woman. She's the only female judge, and she judged in a time of terrible sexual oppression. The Canaanites were very much into ritual sex, cultic sex, and of course, sexual oppression in general. And here comes Deborah, the woman, and delivers Israel during that time. And that sexual pressure is going to show up in Judges in the background, I mean, in Ruth, in the background of Ruth, especially in chapter 2. So it came to pass in the days when the judges judged that there was a famine in the land. Now, if you read Leviticus and you read Deuteronomy, there was a famine. A famine was one of the indications of the wrath of God, or the judging of God upon a nation. I'd really like to go there and just take a look at Leviticus. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 26. This is a really important thing to get because it shows up not only here in the book of Judges, but it's in a lot of the different books of the Bible. It certainly is in the book of Amos, where he says, I made it rain in one place, but not in another, and you didn't listen to me. And it's like, okay, wait a minute, it rained here and not over there, and that's you talking. And yes, it is. So if we go to Leviticus chapter 26, we're going to start in verse 19. And it says in Leviticus 19, God says, well, to get the context of this, we got to back it up to verse 14. But if you will not listen to me and will not do all these commandments, in other words, if you disobey God, here's what's going to happen. Now, Leviticus 26 is very similar to Deuteronomy 28. We could read both places. We don't really need to. It's covered in the commentary. But what you read here, you're also going to read in Deuteronomy 28. So God says it twice very clearly so people get the lesson that if you don't obey God, here's what's going to happen. And then unfortunately, there's all these horrible things, one of which, verse 19, I will break the pride of your power and will make your sky like iron and your soil like bronze, meaning no rain and nothing's going to grow. And he goes down and goes back through. And then verse 26, he shows other things that are going to happen that are terrible. Verse 26, when I break the staff of bread. And I know some of the translations don't translate it this way anymore, but I think it's really important for you and I to understand that bread, physical bread, was such a staple in the biblical culture that a couple different times, I'm thinking 3 or 4 different times in the Bible, that it's called the staff of bread. Now, that is not understood well in a culture in which people don't typically use walking sticks. But in the biblical culture, basically every man carried a walking stick. First of all, because the ground was rough and uneven, but also because you never knew when you were going to be jumped by robbers. You never knew when you were going to be attacked by a stray dog or all kinds of different things. So if you remember, even when Jesus Christ sent out the 12, they had staves in their hand. And that's one of the things, see, when we normally think of the 12 apostles walking around with Jesus, we don't think of them walking around with walking sticks, but they all would have. It was such an incredible part. It's just like, it'd be like us mentioning, I went to the mall. And, well, I went to the mall. I took my wallet, I took my keys. Well, did you take clothes? Well, yeah. Well, you didn't mention clothes. It's like, no, it's pretty simple. If we go out, we're wearing clothes. Although I don't know. I tell you, after being here on the beach in Florida, I'm beginning to doubt that. But, God, I swear, I've seen more flesh in the last 2 weeks. It's like you got to be kidding me. I'm not going there. But anyway, the point is that the staff was so common that it just wasn't even mentioned. And so the staff of bread, just like you leaned on your walking staff, you leaned on bread. And so when God says in verse 26, when I break your staff of bread, meaning there's going to be famine, you're not going to be any food. 10 women will bake your bread in one oven for 10 women. Wow. They don't have much bread. And they will deliver your bread again by weight. In other words, you got to divide it up. And you will eat, but will not be satisfied, meaning you're going to have a famine. Now, let's go back to Ruth chapter 1. So there was a famine in the land. And so what the people understood was that God was behind this famine. Actually, what's going on, and you and I, from a New Testament perspective, need to know this. What's going on is that the people are sinning. God can't protect them anymore. Who wants to destroy them? Who wants to harm them? The devil. So this is the people disobeying. God's like, I can't help you guys out. I'm sorry. And then the devil moves in and causes problems. They didn't know about the devil like we do. That was a New Testament revelation. So they just said you made God mad, and so he caused this problem. Now, one of the ways that we know this famine was a wrath of God type situation is by the geography. And again, I see some faces on this the screen that have been with me to Israel. So I call the geography the fifth gospel. So I am going to go to the land of Israel at this point. Go to one of my nifty maps of Israel. Open this baby up. Let's see. I'm gonna blow up the size a little bit, and I'm going to share my screen. So let's go down to screen share my map. Bang. Okay. You should now be looking at my map. So here's Judah. Here's the tribes of Israel, the country of Judah. And here's the Dead Sea. And here's Moab over here. So here's Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem and Judah, there's a giant famine here. At this point, This is 8 miles across. So here's a giant famine. 8 miles away, no famine. that's how you can tell this is a judgment of God. And when there was a famine in Egypt in the 7 years of famine, that famine was in Egypt and it was in the entire Middle East. Here, you got a famine in Judah, 8 miles away, no famine. That's one of the ways you can tell this is the judgment of God. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So when we understand that kind of thing, opens us up and lets us know when it talks about the days that the judges judged, and we're like, okay, how do we know this is in part of the days of the judges when they were suffering consequences for not believing? Because there's a famine in Judah and 8 miles away, there's no famine. And so it says, so a man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to live in the country of Moab. And in the Hebrew text, it's the fields of Moab, because Moab is a high plateau. So the fields of Moab was often the way the country of Moab was called. It was just a name for it, but we don't put it in the text because if we said he went to live in the fields of Moab, you'd think he went out and lived in a field, and that's not what it's saying. The fields of Moab was one of the names for the country of Moab. So we cover it in commentary and just say the country of Moab in the text. He and his wife and his 2 sons. So one of the take-home, there's a lot of take-home lessons already in verse 1, but one of them is that, yes, if we sin, we open the door for the adversary to come in and cause problems. Another is there's no evidence that Elimelech and his wife and his 2 sons were ungodly. But if the country you live in is ungodly, and the country you live in by its overall ungodliness lets the adversary in to cause problems, it isn't that just like your little house is going to be super protected. Every once in a while, God can do something to give you a blessing that others don't have. But it's one of the reasons that we want to participate in elections. It's one of the reasons we want to speak up in our society, that our voice does matter. We heard in prophecy today about us speak to the people in Dave DeMar's manifestation. You are lights of the world, from what Frank LeCarry brought forth, and so it's really up to us to keep speaking, and that helps back the adversary down. It's easy to go, it doesn't do any good, it just gets me in trouble, I'm not going to do it. And it doesn't help. We've got to participate in protecting our country spiritually, or we will spiral downhill and downhill and downhill. It's just the way it is. And so here Elimelech goes into the land. So verse 2 leaves Israel, goes to Moab. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Malon and Chilion. Elimelech means my God is king. Naomi means pleasant. I think the names that are much harder to determine, but I think the scholars generally have a consensus, is that Malon and Chilion. Malon seems to be from Mala, which is to be sick. Chilion is from Kala, which is to come to an end or to finish, or therefore to be frail. So you've got these 2 children. Now, do I think their names were actually to be sick and to be frail? I doubt it. It could have been. It could have been that when they were born, they were frail and sickly, and that's the way they got named. But it's probably more likely that, like Job, and the word Job, you read the book of Job. Well, Job means the attacked one. Well, no, Mom, what do we want to name our kid? Well, let's name him the attacked one, and maybe he'll get attacked. It's much more likely that Job was named the attacked one after he'd already been attacked, and that was like a nickname. And who's that guy? Oh, he's Job, man. He's the guy that was attacked and did so well and suffered through it and persevered and now is doing great. See, but Malone and Chilion, the chances are that those are names that are going to guide us as we read through the record, that we can say, oh boy, it's probably not going to end well with these guys. I mean, sick and frail, kind of directing us, guiding us forward. And they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they came into the country or the fields of Moab and stayed there. And the word stayed means to be a temporary resident. Doesn't mean that Elimelech in his heart of hearts intended to leave Israel forever. He was just going to stay there until all the famine was over in Israel and then probably go home. And then verse 3 says, then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, she and her 2 sons. And it's interesting that the Bible uses this particular word for left, because it's a word that's often used when somebody's had someone close to them die, but it's also often used when the wrath of God has hit something and there's some that remain, some that survived. I've got notes on that in the commentary. So buried in the Hebrew text here is this thought that although Elimelech left Israel for Moab to get away from the famine that was due to the disobedience of God, he wasn't able to get away from some of the consequences of God's being dissed in Israel. And so Naomi is left there, after the wrath of God is passed. And that's the way that people would look at it. I mean, a woman who loses her husband and her 2 male sons, they would look at that as the wrath of God. And so it tells us that that's the way the people saw that by using this particular word, that she was left, she and her 2 sons. Verse 4, and they took wives for themselves of the women of Moab, and the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And frankly, we don't know what the word Ruth really means. There's some guesses, but it's very difficult to determine the background of that, the etymology of that. We learn from Ruth chapter 4, verse 10, that of the 2 men, Ruth married Mahlon and Orpah married Chilion. We don't know that until Ruth chapter 4, the last chapter of Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Now that gives us an insight into the age of Ruth, because the girls were typically married 12 to 14. And if they lived there for 10 years, then that puts Ruth and Orpah in their early to mid 20s, 22, 23, 24, 25, somewhere in there would be the age of Ruth and Orpah. So that when we start talking about the genealogies, and I mentioned this in my commentary on Ruth 4:18, that people go, well, one of the reasons that these 4 generations couldn't span 365 years is women quit bearing children, but the older men often married younger women. So as long as Boaz could produce sperm, if he's going to marry a 25-year-old girl, then he's going to be able to have children. And so that factors into the literal nature of the genealogy in Ruth chapter 4, and that's pretty important. And then verse 5, no surprise, based on what we know about their names, we have sick and frail, both died. So it's like, oh, geez, okay. I mean, it's sad. I don't mean to laugh about it, but it's just so interesting that if you know what's going on in the text, God is leading us. He's leading us along. And, what a tragedy. I mean, so the woman, and this is singular. And one of the things we see here, I know the title of the book is Ruth, but the main character keeps shifting. In the beginning of the book, the main character is Naomi. And then the main character is going to shift briefly to Ruth, and then the main character is going to shift over to Boaz. So something you need to be aware of. And if there's a lesson in that, it's kind of like we learn in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, that everybody plays a part. Everybody's important. And it isn't that the book of Ruth is dominated by Ruth. She's not. there are different sections that are dominated by different players, and that's important to pay attention to. And if there's a lesson in that, it's a lesson that we have a part to play, and we can plug into God's plan. And that's really important. And so verse 5, it's interesting, Malone and Chilian both died. So it doesn't say, so the women were left, but the woman, this is Naomi, was left without her 2 children and her husband. And so this is, and it's interesting too that it would call them children here and not sons, because it's pointing out that these are the only 2 children that she has. She doesn't at this point even have a daughter to support her. She had 2 sons. And if it had sons in the text, you might be thinking in the background, yeah, but maybe she has a daughter in there somewhere to help. She didn't. She had 2 sons, and now her husband and her 2 children are dead. She is a widow in the true sense of the word. And again, using the word left, and she was left without her 2 children and her husband. Verse 6, and again, now I said this first part was dominated by Naomi. And here we begin to see this in the feminine singular pronouns that are used. It says, then she arose. This is Naomi. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law in order to return from the country of Moab. For in the country of Moab, she'd heard that Yahweh had visited his people by giving them bread. And again, we see the word bread used by metonymy for all kinds of food, but the emphasis on the fact that the main food in the culture was bread, particularly if you come out of Beit Lechem. Beit Lechem is house of bread. So there was a lot of bread in Bethlehem, house of bread. So she had heard. And we don't really know how she heard. I mean, there are different ways she could have heard. We don't really know how that she heard that. And it's important, I think, too, to point out when it says that she heard that Yahweh had visited his people, we need to pay attention to that vocabulary, because when God visits, it doesn't mean he visits in person. God, in this case, God just simply healed the sky. There was rain. He healed the land. There was fertility. And so there was food now. And this is understood in the culture is God has visited. See, a lot of times, especially when you're talking verses that could be used, and people try to use them to prove that Jesus is God, because it'll say that, you know, that when Jesus Christ healed, that God did a great thing or something like that. And they say, there, see, it's God. No, it's not. It's the power of God. God didn't personally visit here. He visited in the person, if you will, of fertile ground and rain. So it's important to pick up on that. So because this vocabulary goes all the way through the scripture. Verse 7, so she, Naomi, set out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the road to return to the land of Judah. And I highlighted that in my text because I used to just kind of read over it and not really think about it. But the more I get into the details of scripture, the more I realize that the roads and the locations of the places that are mentioned are really important. And I'm working very hard, and Sue Carlson's working with me to produce a map that'll have most of the major roads. And it's really important to know that, because, you know, if there was a road around, a well-beaten path, people would take it rather than forging their own path through the wilderness, even if it meant going a little further. And a lot of times, if we know where the major roads are, then we know why certain things happened when they do, and how they did. For example, when Joseph's brothers threw him into a cistern and were talking about killing him, they look up and they see a caravan of the Ishmaelites. Now, the Ishmaelites, you know, were coming from north, from somewhere probably in Syria or beyond, and they're coming and they're going to Egypt. I mean, this is a couple 100-mile journey with a camel caravan, and they happen to go right by the cistern where Joseph is. Why would that be? Well, Joseph and his brothers were in Dothan, and Dothan was on the major caravan route between Syria and Egypt. And if you know that, you know then why the people would look up and go, oh, look, there's a caravan of Ishmaelites. It's like if you stayed there with Dothan long enough, you'd see a lot of different caravans. You could go 5 miles to the east or the west and you wouldn't see any caravans because it wasn't on the caravan route. And so understanding that Dothan was on the caravan route, that was the main road through that area of the country, then lets you know why the brothers could look up and see a caravan of Ishmaelites. And there's so many little records in the scripture that come together once we understand the geography and how the roads fit. And so here it is, they went on the road. Now it probably would have been a lot closer as the crow flies if they just swam across the Dead Sea, but they didn't do that. They went down the road to return to the land of Judah, and probably to avoid the heat and the possible interaction with Edomites, especially coming out of Moab. They would have gone around the northern end of the Dead Sea and probably crossed the Jordan at one of the fords, actually very close, possibly even the very same ford that Joshua and the Israelites used to cross the Jordan River when they entered the land. Verse 8, and Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, each of you return to the house of her mother. May Yahweh show faithful love to you, just as you have shown to the dead and to me. Now, there's a couple things buried in here that I think we need to pay attention to. First of all, she says, go, each of you return to the house of her mother. Now, this is incredibly rare because women didn't own houses. It was the husband that owned houses. In fact, the idea of a house of your mother is so rare that one of the Septuagint manuscripts actually changed it to house of your father. They were like, I can't say house of your mother. They got to say house of your father. But you begin to dig a little deeper and you find out that the house of your mother was used as a phrase generally when there was sex and sexual intimacy involved. So if we take a break here and go to Song of Solomon, chapter 3, and I'll show you one of those verses. So in Song of Solomon, chapter 3, verse 4, it says, I had scarcely passed from then. You know, she's on her bed and then she's seeking the man whom her soul desires. I will get up now in verse 2. I will go about the city. And verse 4, I had scarcely passed from them, from the watchman, when I found him whom my soul loves. I held him and would not let him go until I had brought him into my mother's house, or in the Hebrew text, the house of my mother. And so the two usages in the Bible of the house of my mother, besides the one here in Ruth, all have to do with marriage and sexual intimacy. And so and by the way, when who was it? Was it Isaac? Yeah, I think it was Isaac. Let's see. Yeah, Isaac. When Isaac married Rebekah, he went and he consummated his marriage with her in his mother's tent. It specifically says he went into his mother's tent to consummate his marriage with Isaac and Rebekah. And so what we're seeing here, what's buried very subtly in the text that you have to pick up on the culture, is she's saying, return to the house of your mother. May you grant you find rest in the house of her husband. So she knows what she's basically doing in a very subtle cultural way is saying, I'm releasing you to go home, to find a husband, to get married, to have children back in Moab. And that's what's going on here. So the house of her mother. Yahweh show faithful love to you, just as you have shown to the dead and to me. Verse 9, may Yahweh grant you that you find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lift up their voice and wept. And they grant you that you find rest, because a woman on her own, life was very hard, life was very physical. A woman could rest in the house of her husband. Her husband did a lot of the heavy work. She would have sons, they would help out. There would be male relatives, they would help out. So it was understood there was a rest for women in marriage. Verse 10, they said to her, no, we will return with you to your people. And it's interesting that we learn now in a few verses that Naomi doesn't want to be called Naomi anymore, which means pleasant, but she wants to be called Mara, which means bitter. And what we now begin to see in the text is that Naomi's bitterness begins to show forth. So she starts out and she says, go back, my daughters. And this is an imperative verb in the Hebrew. Go back, my daughters. She's pressing them. Why would you go with me? And why would you go with me it's a rhetorical question, but she's not asking for a reason. And it's important for you to understand this, that when she says, why would you go with me? She's not sitting back and saying, okay, I want to hear your reasons. That's not what she's doing. She's making a statement. She's saying it's stupid for you to go with me. You know, you're not going to find husbands there. Things are going to go badly for you. Things are going to be difficult. You're a Moabite. The Israelites don't like Moab right now. I'll give you reasons why in a minute here. But there's a lot here. So she's saying it's stupid for you to go back with me. That's what she's doing here. Why would you go with me? And then you can see more of the bitterness begin to come out of her. She says, do I still have sons in my gut that they could be your husbands? A lot going on in this statement. First of all, that's a completely stupid statement and off the point. Nobody would have expected, if Malone and Chilean died, you married a relative. You didn't wait for the mom to have other sons. So this is it's a statement that just comes, and you guys have been in arguments where somebody has made an emotional statement that made no sense just because they were emotional. They were angry, they were bitter, and so out came the statement that made no sense, didn't fit the context, didn't fit the culture, you know. And then her use of the word gut, you know, there's a word for womb in Hebrew. It doesn't use it. I looked at the English versions. They translate this womb. They shouldn't have. It misses the point. There's a Hebrew word for womb. This is not it. Oftentimes, the Hebrew word for belly is used of the womb. It's not that word either. This is a word that's used for your gut, your intestines, your bowels. You know, and it reveals the bitterness of Naomi. You know, do I have any more sons in my gut that they could be your husbands? You know, and so this bitterness kind of pours out of Naomi, but we've got to translate the Hebrew right. We've got to see this in the context of what's going on. She's lost her husband. She's lost her two sons. She's in a foreign country. She doesn't know what she's going back to. She doesn't know what's happened in Israel. She knows that there's been oppressions, you know, but what's Israel look like? And she's like, it's stupid for you to go with me. Do I have sons in my gut that they should be your husbands? Go back, my daughters, repeating the same imperative statement. Go your way, for I'm too old to have a husband. Another stupid emotional statement. It's nothing about, first of all, you're not too old to have a husband. You may be in your 50s. Lots of women that old died because lots of women had husbands that died and needed to be pulled into a family clan of some kind. You know, could she have been, yeah, I think she was probably in her late 40s or mid 50s. But the fact of the matter is she wasn't too old to have a husband. And even if she were, it's not the point. You didn't wait around for her to have more sons. She's just being emotional and angry. Now there's a great lesson here. People that are badly personally hurt get emotional and angry. And there's a time to be logical with that. And there's a time to ignore that and let it go and let people blow off steam and then deal with the situation later. And there's a time to say enough, stop being stupid, let's deal with reality. And that's what is going to happen later on here in the book of Ruth. And we'll see that. But what's really important is for you to see look at the Bible's reflection of the genuine nature of what's going on in Naomi's life. You know, one of the things we see in the pagan literature is they write everybody up except their enemies in these glowing terms. The Bible is so real. The Bible shows us, look, when you're dealing with a really, really, really tough situation, like your husband and your two children have died and you're living in a foreign country, you're mad. Okay, we get it. And so that's what it's showing right now. She's angry. She's bitter. I'm too old to have a husband. If I were to say I have hope, even if even have a husband tonight and bear children, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from having husbands? Of course, like I say, none of this is on point. Every bit of this misses the point. And it's just stupid emotional talk. And then she has her third exclamatory statement, no, my daughters. Just, meaning, no, don't do this. You're making a mistake. Go home, is what she's saying. And then she says, for life is bitter for me. And no kidding, we're watching it. Okay, out comes the statement. Life is bitter for me. See, interestingly enough, and I did some work on this, there's no statement in the Old Testament that's the equivalent of a statement like Ephesians 4:32, put away bitterness. There's a lot of statements about the value of joy and how things are going to be joyful, but it was understood that life was difficult. And so there's no statement like put away bitterness. You and I have a different situation. Our salvation is guaranteed. Our hope is clear, much clearer than it was, 1300, 1200 BC. Our hope is very clear. We got the book of Revelation. We know exactly what's coming down, and so what's Philippians say, give thanks always, and Ephesians 4:32, put away bitterness. But here, Naomi, she's bitter, and she says so. Life is very bitter for me. And then she makes this interesting statement, too much for you. A lot of translators go in different ways with this. The Hebrew is pretty clipped, but basically the chewy caramel center of what Naomi's saying is, look, I'm an Israelite. We're going back to Israel, and life is bitter for me. It's going to be too much for you. Stay in Moab, get married, have children, join your family, go to your mother's house. That's what Naomi's saying. And then she makes an interesting statement. The hand of Yahweh has gone out against me. Based on the fact that in her culture, people had turned from Yahweh, we don't really know the clear concept that Yahweh had that Naomi had of Yahweh. We don't really know exactly what she knew about him or believed about him, but she did believe that the hand of Yahweh had gone out against her. So verse 14, the women lifted up their voice and wept again, and Oprah kissed her mother-in-law, which is a kiss goodbye, and Ruth clung to her. And uses the word clung here is the same in Genesis 2:24, where when a man and woman marry, the man is going to cling or cleave to his wife. That's the word here. And so that's clung. Ruth just cleaved to Naomi. Verse 15, and Naomi said, behold, take a look now. Your sister-in-law is going back to her people and to her God. Go back after your sister-in-law. So this tells us that at this point in her life, Naomi was so bitter, she didn't really see an advantage in worshiping Yahweh. Gosh, God, this is so real. There's so many people that have had such a hard life. They don't see an advantage of serving God and they leave God. We've got to understand God makes no promise that this life is going to be easy. In fact, Paul said very clearly, we're going to go through much hardships to enter the kingdom of God. We've got to be willing to tough it out through whatever comes. We've got no promise this life is going to be easy. And we need to know that. And I came out of a movement that, well, if you just had enough believing or faith, things would smooth out. That was smoke and mirrors. You can read my work on that in the appendix in the REV. And that's not the way it works. The statement that Paul made is true. The statement that Peter made, don't be surprised at the fiery trial that's going to try you. And we've got to be able to understand that life can be difficult, and we've got to be able to push through it, And so here Naomi makes it very clear. She doesn't see any particular advantage in worshiping Yahweh over going back to the gods of Moab. And so she says to Ruth, go back. Gosh, go back after your sister-in-law. Now verse 15 or 16 is really, really amazing. because now the scene shifts. You know, it's been Naomi, it's been the first major player. Now Ruth is going to be the next major player. And this is incredible where she goes and what she says. But Ruth said, do not press me to abandon you. And it's very important we understand this vocabulary, because Ruth here, basically, it's like Naomi's been crying in her beard. Does she have reason to be bitter? Yes. Has Ruth been letting her rant? Yes. But at some point it goes too far and you've got to say enough. Let's get real here. And so she says, do not press me to abandon you. And she uses the word abandon, not just leave. You know, don't ask me to leave you. It's not that. You're pressing me to abandon you and I'm not going to do it. And that's basically how she stepped up. One of the commentators, I said, you could translate this phrase, back off. I mean, it's powerful. And the other thing is the word press in the Hebrew has the meaning of press or push or urge, but it also has the meaning of attack or assault. She could have used a different word, but she uses a word here that has two meanings. In other words, she's seeing, you know, a triple threat. Go back, my daughters. Go back, my daughters. No, my daughters. She's seeing this as an attack. You're attacking my soul. You're attacking my heart. Back off. I'm taking a stand here. Here's what I've decided. Don't attack me, assault me, press me to abandon you or to return from following after you, exclamation point, because there's, imperative verbs in here, some of the verbs. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people are my people, and your God is my God. And it's very important we get the tense here right, because almost every version reads, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. But there is a Hebrew future verb, and the text doesn't use it. And that becomes really important because it tells you that Ruth has already decided. She's seen enough about Israel. She's heard enough about Israel. She knows how their God works. She knows how their law works. And as a Moabite and one who was not raised with the Israelite religion, she has seen enough and she's made up her mind. She says, your people are my people and your God is my God. And the texts that say your God will be my God, pick that up from the next phrase, where you die, I will die. But I can tell you why that's future. Because they're deathless future. That's why. So yeah, there's a future tense verb used, where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. There's a future tense verb. There's a future tense verb in I will go, I will lodge, because she wasn't there yet. They were still on the road. So you see the appropriate use of the future tense verb. But when it comes to Ruth's heart, boy, she had seen enough. I mean, the manifestations today, you know, we're so, in Greg's prayer, we can bring more people into the family if we'll, you know, by our witness and stuff, how God is powerful and mighty. And you know, we can speak to people. We're the lights of the world, you know. And here's Ruth, a Moabite. Now she's lived with an Israelite family for 10 years and she'd seen enough. And she said, your people are my people and your God is my God. And you're not going to drive me away from him. And that's how tenacious we have to be about God. And then she goes into the future, and where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And then look how, see, she's so inculcated into her understanding and belief in Yahweh, she now uses a Yahwistic curse formula upon herself if she breaks her commitment. She says, Yahweh, do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. In other words, she is so firmly committed that Yahweh is her God that now she imprecates herself by using an Israelite curse formula. Yahweh, do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. So she speaks, and then obviously that, you know, Naomi's just, you know, she's like, okay, when she saw that she, Ruth, was determined, the Hebrew word is resolution, determination, but also persistence. You know, it's maybe assiduously or something like that in English, I don't know, but determined to go with her, that she was not only resolute, but she was being persistent. It didn't look like she was ever going to change her mind to go with her. Then she said no more. And so then Ruth and Naomi are going to go back into the land of Israel. And I love, again, the lesson we see here in Ruth, that bad things happen and people become emotional, and sometimes you got to let them rant and vent steam. But then there's a point at which you take a stand and say enough, and this is what I've decided to do. And we certainly see that in Ruth. What an amazing woman she is. And in the next teaching, we're going to see her meet an amazing man. But we're far enough along for right now. So thank you all for your attention, and I'm going to be around. So whatever y'all want to share, talk about, ask, we're wide open.